Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Beth Gardner. I now work at the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University. I will tell you that we're here today through generous funding from the Marr and Taub Foundations, who fund a project called Ready, Set, Go. And we've been doing this project for a few years. Some of you we've met in previous rounds of preschool expansion. And our role is to work in collaboration with the Department of Education and in conjunction with Advocates for Children of New Jersey to get the word out about preschool expansion, to provide some application preparation support. And we also do some initial, some implementation support for those of you that get funded. I will tell you that my experience before I came to NEAR is that I worked at the Department of Education in the Division of Early Childhood Education, as did Karen. I'll have her introduce herself. And I do want to say that although we have lots of answers to many of your questions, we are not here representing the Department of Education today. We will give you our best answers to our questions, and then we will hope that questions that we can't answer today will show up on the DOE Q&A that should be coming out someday soon. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Karen Garver, who's going to take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth. As Beth said, I'm Karen Garver. I'm also with the National Institute for Early Education Research. And as Beth mentioned, I spent a large chunk of my career at the Department of Education, about 16 years at the DOE. And most of that time was actually in the Division of Early Childhood Education, working on these very forms that we're going to talk through today. And Beth was being modest. She spent a lot of her time at the DOE shepherding districts through the process of starting preschool programs. So she has a wealth of experience there. We also have Kate Hodges on the call with us today, our other colleague at NEAR, who has been seeing a lot of districts through this application process over the course of the last 3 years or so. So hopefully we can answer a lot of your questions today, as Beth said. We're recording the session today, so we'll make sure that it's available to you and to any of your colleagues who might not be able to join today. If there's anything that you missed, you want to go back and hear. But the other good news is that this webinar isn't a one and done. So you have access to us at any time between now and when you submit your application. You're welcome to send us questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So feel free to ask us questions today. We'd love to invite you to throw questions into the chat as we go. Just in the interest of time, it would be easier for us if you put them in the chat for now, and we'll try to answer them as we go, and then leave some time at the end for you to either continue to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourselves at that point and ask us some questions, you're more than welcome to. It's probably going to take me the better part of an hour to get through the budget workbook itself. So just for folks for planning purposes, but again, we'll stop and take your questions from the chat as we go, and then hopefully have some time at the end for questions. For the most part today, we put a tip sheet together that Beth is going to send out to all of you as soon as this is over, if you haven't received it already. And a lot of what I'm going to talk through today will be summarized on those tip sheets, hopefully something that's handy for you as you're going through the process, filling out your application. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up the budget workbook. And Beth, I'll just keep checking in with you about size and visibility of the workbook. Does everything look okay? Do I need to make it a little bigger?
I think a little bigger might be helpful for some of us.
All right.
If that works for you. That looks better.
All right, and interrupt me at any point if I forget to ask to make sure that the sizing is okay. So jumping right into the district budget workbook, I know for me, when I opened up the file that the DOE sent out, it actually didn't open to table 1 right away. And I would encourage you to make sure that you start with table 1. I know it can be really tempting to kind of jump through and try to go right to the district budget statement and dig in there. But a lot of this workbook depends on the information that you submit in table 1. And then a lot of the information that you submit on subsequent tables will impact what you have to input on your district budget statement. So I really stress that you start with table 1 and complete the information there before you start moving on. It'll help you just get a sense of where you're going with the rest of the workbook. Once you look at table 1, the very first thing you're going to want to do is select your district name and county name from the drop-down box here. This is for a couple different reasons. One is because it actually impacts what funding you get, what county you sit in. So you want to make sure that you select that. And 2, it has to do with the section that pre-populates right here. We don't quite have everybody muted, I think. I don't know if you can go in and mute folks. That would be great. I think we have a little bit of background noise. But once you go ahead and enter your county and your district name from the drop-down box, what's going to happen is automatically you're going to see these numbers pre-populate right here. And this is the Department of Education's estimate of your universe of 3- and 4-year-old general education preschoolers. And this number pops up for a number of different reasons. One, it's how the department is going to look to see that you're moving towards serving 90% of this population of children. The reason why it's general education is really important when it comes to this application. And it's because this funding that you're applying for is for your general education preschoolers only. So your special needs preschoolers are being funded separately through your IDEA Part B funding. So this funding is only for your gen ed preschoolers. And what the department does is they look at your district's most recent first grade general education enrollment, and they take that and multiply it by 2. So in this particular case for this district that I modeled, they had 89 first graders most recently. So they're estimating about 89 3-year-olds, about 89 4-year-olds, and a total of 178 preschoolers, gen ed, in this school district. They use first grade because obviously kindergarten is not yet mandatory in the state of New Jersey. So first grade is just a more solid estimation. But keep in mind that it's an estimation. It's something that the department is using as a yardstick, but it's obviously not necessarily a perfect number. I also want to pause here. I think, Beth, we understand that there might be a little bit of an issue with some of the districts and the data that's coming out of the drop-down box. Is that right?
We have heard that there's been a little bit of confusion, at least in a couple of districts, about picking up a district with the same name but in a different county. And if your universe and these numbers that are on your workbook do not match the number of 3-year-olds or number of 4-year-olds isn't close to matching your first grade enrollment, I would encourage you to reach out to the Department of Ed, and I'll drop their DOE early child email address you probably all have it, but I'll drop it into the chat. So it shouldn't be an issue in most cases, but because the district name is associated with a particular county and the county rates are variable across counties, we want to be sure that you're not working off of a different district's universe numbers and that it gets straightened out by DOE before you submit your application.
And even more importantly, that you're not working off another county's per child rates, because that will impact your budget pretty significantly in some cases. So, so if you suspect that there's a problem there, we encourage you to get in touch with the Department of Education to try to get that fixed. It's just a little glitch in the formula that's pulling those numbers in. So once you've selected your county in your district, slide down here to this actual enrollment section. So here, for those of you that already have a preschool program in place, you want to describe to the department what that looked like in the 2021 school year. So in this case, what I modeled out is a school district that had solely a preschool disabled preschool program. So they have some 3-year-olds and some 4-year-olds in self-contained preschool disabled settings and nothing more than that. And if that's the case for your district, that's all you would fill out in this section and then move on. If you happen to have children who are paying tuition, you would add them in this row here. And then if you have children with disabilities who might be included in classrooms with those tuition paying children, you can include them in this row here. And I just want to pause and ask folks if they can make sure to mute themselves. We have a little bit of background noise that's coming in. And so if you are a district that's currently receiving money, even if it's not fully funding your preschool program, so if you're an Ekba district or an LE district, you want to make sure that you're describing to the department what your enrollment looked like in the 2021 school year here. And so you would use this row 22, to describe your general education children that you were using DOE funding, even if only partially, to fund in the 2021 school year. Now you'll notice that there are some rows here that are grayed out. And the reason these are grayed out is because this set of forms actually gets used for all of the districts that get preschool funding. So including districts that are already approved to receive expansion funding. So obviously that's not you guys yet. And that's why the department grayed those out so that you wouldn't be tempted to add any enrollment figures there. So you can go ahead and just skip those rows. This section here and the section that follows, these are only to be used in this case if you happen to already be in a situation where you contract with a Head Start program or a private childcare center to serve children. If you don't do that, you just leave these sections blank. The department's not asking you to do a canvas of all the existing childcare centers and ask them what their enrollment was last year. This is solely to be filled out only if you happen to have already been in some sort of contracted relationship with a Head Start program or a private childcare program to serve children. So if you did happen to do that, you would need to fill out this section, but if not, you would just skip that and focus solely on this upper section of the budget here. At the bottom, then you'll see, so in this district, because I didn't model a district that was yet serving any general education preschoolers, you can see it's showing that my current proportion of the general education universe served is 0. And that's not something that will concern the department at this point. They're expecting some districts that don't yet have gen ed programs established. So don't be concerned if you see zeros in this section of the workbook. But then we scroll down to the projected enrollment section. And here's where you want to show the department what you want your program to look like in the 21-22 school year. So what I tried to do here was model a district that's moving from a solely preschool disabled program to a program that's not only inclusive, so the preschoolers with disabilities are included in classrooms with their general education peers, but it's also mixed delivery. So I added in a classroom here with a Head Start provider and a couple classrooms here with contracted childcare centers. So a couple things to think about when you're filling this out. You want to make sure that the department is very much in support of inclusive preschool classrooms. So they prefer to see you moving preschoolers with disabilities into classrooms with their general education peers. But one really important thing to remember is that regardless of whether you have an inclusive setting or just general education children, you're capped at 15 children per classroom. So a lot of times districts make the mistake of putting budgeting for 15 gen ed kids in the classroom, and then they start adding special needs children on top of that. And you can't do that in this case. Your total has to be a max of 15 children in any given classroom. So you'll see what we modeled out here is a total of 60 children in district settings, which would equal 4 total classrooms. 1 classroom in this Head Start setting. And then you'll see later that I modeled out 2 different private providers, one with 1 classroom and one with 2 classrooms for a total of 45 children. And then down here, when you look at the bottom, you'll see that this district has moved from serving 0% of its general education children to serving a little over 40% of its gen ed 3-year-olds and almost 71% of its gen ed 4-year-olds, which is not a bad jump for a school district and would make for a good application to the Department of Education. I'm going to pause there and, oh, actually, no, I'm not going to pause there. I'm just going to add a couple of other thoughts. If you are an Ekba or an LE district, so again, a district that's already receiving a portion of funding to serve children from the Department of Education, you're going to want to make sure that you include children in these rows wherever applicable. So if you're serving children in district classrooms in the 2021 school year, school year, you'll want to put them in these rows right here, show the department what, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. If you were already approved by the department to serve a certain number of children under your Ekba and LE funding, you'll want to represent those children in this row here. And then this expansion row is where you're going to show them additional children who you're going to be serving. Sorry, I slipped back into the into last year's section for a second there. So children you're currently funded to serve in this row, and then children who you're increasing slots for in this row here. I know someone had asked us a question a few days ago about what the circumstances would be in which you would use this tuition line. It's going to be probably fairly rare for most of you to use that tuition line. It's really only going to come into play in possibly two scenarios. One, if you if you're already serving or you're already projecting to serve as many preschool gen ed students as want to be served in your district and you still have capacity available, you could work with a neighboring district to serve some of their children on a tuition basis. The other case would be potentially if you have 3- and 4-year-old children of staff members who are not residents of your district. Again, once you've served all the resident children who want to be served, if you still have capacity left over, you could serve those children on a tuition basis. The department is seeking for you, if you currently are a program that charges tuition for your preschool program to general education children, what the department is looking for you to do is to supplant that tuition with this funding. They want parents to not have to pay for this program. So we've actually seen cases where school districts have collected tuition already over the summertime. They receive the word from the DOE and then actually just refund that money back to the parents who've paid tuition. So those would be the circumstances under which you'd pay tuition. Beth, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump
Sure.
in to clarify that DOE's expectation is that there are no tuition students unless you are serving your full universe. So they're really expecting you to be serving the full universe of children as estimated in the workbook through the first grade enrollment. And likewise, the same is true for out-of-district students that may be staff children. So unless you can show that you're at least 90% of your universe and that you couldn't quite get all the rest of them in, they will likely reject an application that has any tuition students in it, I would say.
Thanks, Beth. That's great clarification.
And we do have a question here.
Sure.
I don't know if we want to address it now. How would you show children that are in inclusion with gen ed students for a half day and in a self-contained ABA program for the other half of the day? I don't know if you want to respond to that. Or
why don't you go ahead, Beth? I know the department has an opinion on that type of a model.
Yeah, I would say that for this application, the department's going to be looking for you to move any inclusion students into a full day program. So they will not be funding a half day program for any students that are being moved in part-time. So it's a complicated calculation, and one of the trickiest bits about moving from fully special ed program to a gen ed program. But the expectation is that all children, regardless of their status with an IEP or as gen ed students, would have access to a full day program.
Right. And I think the department also, and I'm not sure that this is what was being asked, but just in case it comes up, the department also strongly discourages the idea of children being put into 2 half-day sessions as opposed to 1 full-day session. I know that's come up in the past, and it's strongly discouraged by the department. You'd have a much stronger application if the children are being projected to just be in 1 full-day session.
And it is expected that, if you're a fully special ed program at this point, the department does not have an expectation that every child will be moved over into an inclusive setting. The ultimate goal for districts is that a minimum of 50% of their children will be in inclusive settings, but that's certainly something that happens over the course of time. As you grow your universe, they'll be looking for you to move more children with disabilities into the inclusive setting over the years to come. So certainly expect you to take a leap, and but might not expect you to go all the way in the first year.
Yep, great point. Thanks, Beth. I'm going to move on to table 2, and feel free if other questions pop up related to table 1. We're happy to revisit it as we go along. And again, for anyone who joined late, feel free to put any questions in the chat. For now, we'll answer them through the chat, and then once we get through all of the tabs in the budget workbook, we're happy to let folks or have folks unmute themselves and ask questions, or continue to just ask them through the chat. Table 2, the goal of table 2 is for you to show the Department of Education essentially the exact same information you showed them on table 1, but in a slightly different configuration. So here you're going to make sure that you have one row completed for every classroom that you're going to have open in the 21-22 school year, and every classroom that you had open in the 20-21 school year. So you can see what I did here on the previous tab. I talked about moving from children in self-contained settings to inclusive settings. So we had, I'm going to pop back to table 1 for a moment. So what we had here were 8 children who were served in half-day preschool disabled settings, and 18 children who were served in full-day preschool disabled settings. So when you move to table 2, in this section here, this is where you're representing that same information from the prior school year. So here you can see where I have the 8 children in the half-day session, and then 9 children in each of 2 different classrooms in a full-day program. So this total equals what I had on table 1. And you can see down here, there's a message that says that my current preschool enrollment correctly matches what I have in table 1. So what you don't want to have, so if you make a mistake here and accidentally put 8 or 9 children here instead of 8, you'll see you very quickly get an error message saying that your numbers don't match and to please correct it. Can't stress enough to take those error messages seriously. It's something that the reviewers at the DOE look at and potentially take some points off for. And it's partly to them, it's just signaling that something's not quite right, and they don't know whether to take table 1 as what you're looking to do or take table 2 as what you're looking to do. So really important to make sure that these 2 tables agree with each other. And then same thing when you move over here and look at the projected enrollment. So we have these 4 classrooms here for in-district settings, 1 classroom in a Head Start setting, and 3 classrooms in 2 different private providers here. Again, what's really important to remember is that when you are providing an inclusive preschool program, your total number of children cannot exceed 15. So these numbers here are including both the preschoolers with disabilities that I was projecting and the general education preschoolers that I was projecting. One other thing to note about table 2 is that the department and the reviewers understand that, especially if you're opening new classrooms, you may not have the staff hired yet to staff those classrooms, and that's entirely acceptable. But you still need to represent those classrooms with a row on this form. And this, you're going to hear me say this over and over again on various forms as we go through the workbook. What you do is just indicate the location of the classroom, and in place of the teacher's name, you just type in "to be hired," and that just indicates to the department that you haven't filled that position to this point. And it's more than acceptable to do that. And you can see I'm even modeled it out for one of the classrooms in the private provider setting. So it doesn't matter whether the person hasn't been hired at the district setting, a Head Start setting, a childcare setting, regardless. You want to make sure you put that row in and just indicate that the person hasn't been hired yet. So that is a quick overview of table 2. Beth, anything that I missed going over that?
There's a clarifying question I wanted to see if you can address about
Sure.
what year the universe is calculated on. I think it's 2 years,
Yeah.
which in this case would be the 2019-2020 school year, would you say?
So
Maybe even further back.
Based on my understanding, so when I was at the department, what we did by the time we were putting these forms out, it was usually in the fall for the next year. So we had to use the prior year's ASSA because, of course, we didn't have the current year's ASSA. It wouldn't surprise me if the department actually used your 1920 enrollment because they would have had your ASSA verified from 1920 already. So to be perfectly honest, I don't know from what year they took it this year. It might have been 1920, but in all likelihood, it was the 2021 school year because I assume they have those numbers verified. And I understand that could mean some additional variability in your universe numbers just because last year was the kind of year that we had. But again, I would take this universe seriously, but also with a little bit of a grain of salt. The department does know that it's an estimation and one that you'll be able to talk with them about. In fact, there are opportunities for you even in your program plan, your application, to discuss your universe and your plans for meeting your universe. So if you have some concerns about it being particularly off one way or the other, you have the opportunity to do that with the department. But really what they're looking for, particularly in this first year, is for you to be making a good faith effort to expand your program beyond where it is right now.
We like to say ambitious yet achievable.
Yes, we steal that term from the federal government. They like to use that a lot. So we went through table 2. Table 3, I'm not going to spend much time on. It's very straightforward. If you are planning to contract with a private provider or a Head Start agency, you just provide contact information for those entities here. I will say that the department has a very strong commitment to a mixed delivery system. Mixed delivery meaning that children are served in a variety of different settings. So district, Head Start, private provider. So if you haven't started contacting private providers in your area, strongly recommend that you do that. And speaking of meeting your universe, working with private providers is a wonderful way to make progress towards meeting your universe. When you think about it, these organizations are already serving children who are residents of your district. So it's low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways to work with private providers to increase the number of children who are being served. The private providers benefit from getting a significant amount of state funding to improve the quality of their program, have the opportunity to interact with those private providers and the program that they're providing for children who are ultimately going to be entering your school system as kindergartners and first graders. So just a PSA on our end to encourage mixed delivery wherever it's possible.
And I would add in, as you know, from the DOE mandatory meeting, that any district meeting a base score of 70+ points will get an additional 5 points. 3 points, I think it is, of priority points for contracting.
Excellent. So moving on to table 4, this is what the top of it looks like. I'm just going to scroll down to the meat of the table. And please don't be concerned if your table looks a little bit different from mine. I deleted out extraneous rows just so I could make it a little bit bigger for folks to look at during this presentation. What you're doing here is showing the district an overview of your preschool teaching staff and their qualifications to teach preschool. So similar to table 2, you want to make sure that you have one row for every classroom that you will have operating in the 21-22 school year. So again, you see these 4 rows for the in-district setting, 1 in the Head Start setting, 3 in the private provider settings. Again, if you don't know the name of a teacher yet, you just indicate to be hired. And really what you want is for all of these names that you have listed on table 2 should be the same names that get listed on table 4. So you'll indicate the teacher's date of hire and number of years of preschool teaching experience, and then their highest level of education achieved. This section, just a little trick of the trade for this section, the department is looking just for you to indicate the highest level of education obtained. So for example, this teacher I modeled out has a master's degree. You would only indicate the master's degree as opposed to indicating both the bachelor's degree and the master's degree. It's really minor, but I can tell you right now, it's a pet peeve of DOE reviewers. And why give your reviewers anything to be annoyed about? Just give them that highest level of education obtained. Probably not something that's going to make or break your application, but might just get you a a smile from your reviewer for doing that section correctly. This next section where you look at the credentials and certification of your teachers. So dissimilar to the highest education section, you do want to check off everything that applies for your teacher. So for example, you might have a teacher who has their, a P3 certification and also a special education certification. And if that's the case, you want to check both of those off. The similar to the highest level of education though, and this is another pet peeve of DOE reviewers, is for example, right here, oftentimes we would see applications come in that would check off that a teacher has a P3, but then also that the teacher has a CEAS. And it's really one or the other. And in particular, they wouldn't want to see P3, CE, and CEAS. It's one of those three things at a time. So if the teacher has a P3, the department doesn't care if the teacher needed a CE or a CEAS to get it. Alternatively, if the teacher has the CE or the CEAS, you want to mark that off. There's nothing wrong with your teachers having the CE or the CEAS and not the P3 yet. Any of these is absolutely acceptable. It's just that these are mutually exclusive categories as far as the DOE is concerned. So you want to make sure that you just check off the one that applies. And then this last category here, language abilities, it's an opportunity to indicate whether or not your teachers have bilingual, bicultural, or ESL certification or a foreign language proficiency. But I want to make sure it's clear that these are not requirements of your teachers. It's something that's helpful for the department to know, but don't think that because this section is here, it's something that all of your teachers have to have in order to be teaching in the program. And then one of the last things to know, again, you may have situations where your teachers aren't hired yet, and you indicate that they're to be hired, but you'll notice that I left the rest of it blank. So the DOE is not expecting you to try to predict the education and experience and credentials of people you haven't hired yet. You can just indicate you know that you have to hire that teacher and then leave the rest of the row blank. So they're not asking you to be clairvoyant in this section, thank goodness. So the other thing to remember is you do need to provide information on the teachers who will be in any contracted Head Start or private provider classrooms. And that is also the case for Table 4A. And I won't spend a ton of time on Table 4A just because it's so similar to Table 4. Table 4A is meant to represent your teacher assistants. So you're separating your teachers from your teacher assistants in these two forms. Again, providing information about their hiring, their education, their credentials. One thing I want to make sure to point out, though, this section here on CDA and hours towards a CDA and other certification, I want to just be clear that these are not requirements of your teacher assistants. So you'll notice here in the model, like there are quite a few of the teacher assistants I modeled out who do not have a CDA, and that's perfectly acceptable. A high school diploma is the minimum requirement for your teacher assistants in the program. So if your TAs happen to have a CDA or are working towards a CDA or another certification, that's fantastic and you want to put that in. But if they don't panic. It's not something that they have to have. And one other thing I think that, and Beth, feel free to say this more eloquently than I'm about to, but the other thing to remember is that there are some districts that choose to add an additional adult in the classroom. The DOE's funding is set up only to support one teacher and one teacher assistant in every classroom, separate, of course, from any additional adults who are there to support children with disabilities. But the DOE's funding doesn't support a co-teaching model, for example. So you'll need to make sure that you have just one teacher and one teacher represented, one teacher and one teacher assistant per classroom represented across Table 4 and Table 4A. Anything else to jump in on there, Beth?
No, I don't. No, it was just fine.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So popping over to Schedule A, here is where you are going to provide a summary for the districts of for the department of all the staff who are going to be supporting the preschool program and or funded through preschool education aid. The first thing the department asks you to do here is to select whether or not your district has a settled teacher salary scale for the 21-22 school year. I want to make it clear that your answer to this question has no bearing on the success of your application. It's really there just to give the department reviewers a sense of whether or not your salary projections might change significantly. So if you have a settled guide, obviously you're using that guide to estimate what the salary of your teaching staff will be for the 21-22 school year. If you don't have a settled guide, you might be projecting something based on where you think it might settle. So it's really just a note to the department that you might need to come back and revise these numbers at some point in the future. But again, not something that will have any bearing on whether or not you get accepted to expand your program. So in this form, you're going to be, again, listing out all of your teachers, all of your teacher assistants. The department is going to count and make sure that you have one teacher assistant for every classroom. One difference between Schedule A and a lot of the prior tables we've been looking at, you'll notice that I only have the district staff on this Schedule A. So you do not need to list out all of your private provider teachers, teacher assistants, and administrative staff. Only the district teaching and administrative staff on Schedule A. Your private providers, should you contract with them, will have a separate budget workbook that they have to fill out, and that has a Schedule A within it. And the department will provide you with that budget template if they haven't already at some point to work with private providers to figure out what their program will look like. But luckily for you all, you don't need to have that information in this worksheet. It certainly would make it much more challenging to complete. So in addition to looking to make sure that the teachers and the teacher assistants are there, the department reviewers are going to look to make sure that all the code required positions are in place. So the master teacher, the early childhood supervisor, the community parent involvement specialist, the preschool intervention and referral specialist, the nurse, etc. And they're going to look to make sure that they are budgeted in appropriate ratios. So we know that, let me just make this a little bit bigger if that's easier for folks to see. We know that, for example, master teachers are required at a ratio of 1 for every 20 classrooms. So what I did here was figure out that for the number of classrooms across district, Head Start, and childcare settings that I modeled out for this district, they would need a 0.4 FTE master teacher. So what I showed here is a portion of that individual's funding being covered by preschool education aid, and a portion of that individual's salary being covered with another funding stream. So you'll see I have the same person listed here twice with the same job title, but their FTE is split across 2 different sections on this form. And that's something that's acceptable. That where this might happen is, for example, if you chose to split fund your master teacher between preschool education aid and, say, special education funding, knowing that that master teacher is going to be working with all classrooms, including classrooms that have preschoolers with disabilities. It's not something you have to do, but it's there in case it helps you illustrate to the department how you're going to make sure that you fill all of these code required positions. Another thing to point out is that there are positions that can be shared. So what I modeled out here is a district that would have one person acting as the early childhood supervisor and the community parent involvement specialist. And that's something else that's acceptable to do, particularly in smaller districts where you only have a relatively small number of classrooms. So it's going to be hard for you to have, 8 different people filling 8 different positions. You might have one person who's wearing a number of different hats. So you're going to fill out the full-time equivalent, the salary step where it's applicable. If the person was working for you in the 2021 school year, you'll fill out their salary and benefits. And then for everybody on here, you should have their 21-22 salary and benefits projected. One thing to note, I noticed in the instructions for this sheet, it actually indicates that you do not need to provide salary and benefit information for any individuals who you have listed in this bottom half of Schedule A. For my money, I would. I think it's clearer to the reviewers. It makes sort of a full picture available to them. But you don't have to, according to the directions of this worksheet. So just keep that in mind, that these numbers here don't necessarily need to be here. Something else that you don't have to do, but that I recommend doing, and something that I found incredibly helpful reviewing budgets like this at the department, when you do have individuals who are part-time, or actually these probably aren't part-time FTEs, they're just part-time funded through this particular funding stream, is to, in these columns over on the right-hand side that are unlocked, to go ahead and just do the calculation of what that prorated salary and the prorated benefit amount comes out to. It can sometimes be challenging to figure out whether or not the dollar amount that's listed in this salary column represents the full-time salary or the prorated salary, depending on what the position is. And sometimes we don't know how long a person has been in a position. So, it might, well, maybe this individual has just been the clerical worker in this district for 30 years and they have a salary that's higher than expected, and this is the full equivalent, or maybe not. Maybe this is the already prorated salary. So just to make it abundantly clear, what I did here was just put in a little calculation that takes the full-time equivalent, multiplies it by the salary, gives the resulting amount here, and the same thing with the benefits. And then it just gives a sense to the reviewers how you went about putting your budget together. And it also makes it a little bit, I think, easier for you when you're trying to populate your district budget statement. You'll know which amounts you need to be pulling over to that form. And I'm going to revisit this when I get into the district budget statement, how this information from this form needs to get pulled over onto that district budget statement. Beth, I'll just pause there really quickly in case there are
a few things. First, let me just clarify with you. So you're not recommending that the prorated salary go directly in column G. You're suggesting it's cleaner to put the full salary and then a prorated share off to the side.
To me, it is. Like I said, it is not something that you're required to do. I think it is often confusing for the reviewers so this $30,000 salary is actually a really good example, because the only thing we know about this clerical worker is that this person, well, actually, sorry, maybe this isn't a good example because it's a to be hired person. So you would know what salary you were offering to this person ahead of time. But say this was a named individual on your Schedule A, you can look at this $30,000 number and say, man, that could be a relatively newly hired person whose full-time equivalent salary is $30,000, and you're going to prorate it half that, and so $15,000. Or this could be a very well-established person who's been in your district for 20 or 30 years, whose total salary is actually $60,000, and you've already prorated it by half. And the department reviewer just doesn't know which number this represents. So to me, it just makes it much, much clearer if you just put a little note here that says, here are the salaries that are prorated part-time. Makes it really clear. The only numbers that are here are ones that are adjacent to rows that have less than 1.0 FTE. But again, this is purely recommendation on my part. But I do think it's helpful for the reviewers.
Thank you. A couple of other things. You talked about shared positions, which are permissible, as you said, right, especially for the smaller districts. I would just like to point out that it's not permissible to have a shared position of a supervisor and a coach. So you can't, the supervisor can't also be the master teacher. So that's one thing that's not permissible. In some cases, right, some of the positions, and sometimes for very small programs, it is the CPIS, the community parent involvement specialist, that becomes a stipended position. It's often the person who is really well entrenched in the community, knows the families really well, and it might be a social worker, someone who's already working with parents that can be stipended to do the position. And it is also permissible to hire consultants for some of this work. You can hire consultants. You can to come in as coaches for small programs. You can hire consultants to come in as the preschool intervention referral specialist for very small programs. A question did come up about how do you represent independent contractors on Schedule A?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer that, though, one other option for sharing that we've seen done very successfully is district sharing with each other some of these positions. So I know we've seen it happen in a couple of different ways. We've seen districts that are applying reach out to each other and say, you hire half a master teacher, I hire half a master teacher. We have one person who we're going to share across our two districts that are close in proximity. Also seen some districts get in touch with other well-established districts. So for example, some of the Abbott districts, if they're neighbors of yours, they have veteran master teachers on staff, and they're sometimes willing to loan them out. Obviously, you would be paying for their time, but in some cases, they're willing to do that. So there's some interesting ways to share those positions, particularly if you're a smaller district. So if you are hiring a consultant, I think what I would do is, in particular, if you don't know who the person is yet, you could say to be hired and then just write consultant right here. And if that's the case, what you'd likely wind up doing is deleting out this benefit amount. At least in my experience, generally, when you have consultants come in, you're projecting a salary and not a benefit amount to go along with it. But that would indicate why to the department you might not be budgeting for that. But I think you could really put it anywhere. I mean, honestly, if you put it in here, that would be fine as well. The other thing to make sure to do is to talk about it in your budget narrative. So the department asks you for a summary of your staff and who they are and what they're doing, and that's another opportunity for you to detail that. I'm going to apologize in advance. There may be a little bit of background noise for a second on my end. There's a little bit of lawn work going out, so I apologize if it gets noisy, but hopefully it will go by quickly. So I'm going to jump over to the provider people amounts workbook. Yeah.
Two more things.
And here comes the noisiness. Sorry. Hold on 1 second.
One other question. I was just going to say, like on Schedule A, likewise, any stipended position can be dropped into the Schedule A in the same way.
Absolutely.
Stipend can be added here. And there is a question we have: when projecting the upcoming year's salary and benefits, are we basing it on the projected educational level of the person identified as to be hired? Would you recommend a starting salary for the position?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was a point in time where the department actually required districts to budget for to be hired staff on step one. And that requirement's no longer in place. So it's really up to you. I think probably what I would do is just look at some of your past hiring history and what the average has been in terms of the experience level you've been able to hire at, and most recently. But honestly, you'll have opportunities to revise this even after your application is approved. You also have unlimited opportunities to transfer funding within your budget once the program starts. So don't be concerned if you over or undershoot the mark on these estimations. You'll have plenty of opportunities to revise as needed. And in fact, I think the department will expect that.
And there's also a question about, can a nurse be funded through PEA? So the answer to that question is yes. And,
absolutely, yes. This is purely an example, putting the nurse here just to show that some positions can be put below the line, but absolutely your nurse is a position that can be funded through preschool education aid, most definitely.
It's one full-time equivalent nurse for 300 preschoolers.
Right.
So you will, again, this is going to be much more likely to be a cost share unless you have a very large program and you're going in big. You will not be hiring a full-time nurse, but you'll be cost sharing with another program, another funding stream.
And Beth, all of the requirements for full-time equivalents, I believe, are found in the budget guidance, but they're also in administrative code. And are they in the NFO? I don't think I saw them there.
Some of the requirements are in the NFO, and I do believe it mentions the 1 to 300. Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that in the budget guidance, they're all named out in there. So if you have a question about how many master teachers you need, how many PERS you need, how many nurses you need, et cetera. That's all laid out in the budget document.
And how would you estimate if you had let's say you have a full-time nurse in an elementary school building with 10 classrooms and 2 of those are preschool classrooms, would you do a sort of a student or classroom prorated?
I've seen districts do it both ways, and both are acceptable. I think as long as there's some logic to how you've determined what the FTE is, that's perfectly acceptable. I think, like I said, I've seen districts do it on prorated by number of children. I've seen them prorated by number of classroom. But something to keep in mind with your nurses in particular, and your master teachers, if you are contracting with Head Start or a childcare provider, your master teachers and your nurses are ministering to those classrooms as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So you, for example, might need a nurse who's available to, on occasion, stop over at another building location in order to check on things there. So just something else to keep in mind.
And I would say also consider that Head Start programs may likely have a nurse on staff already. So you may be able to consider that the use of that, any nurse or coach that they already have on staff as part of your payment to them, where they could cover the coaching and the nursing themselves.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to pop over to the provider per pupil amounts workbook. This one, again, please don't be concerned if your sheet looks different from mine. I just deleted a whole bunch of rows so that I could make it bigger and folks could still see it. So this worksheet is where you tell the department, again, any Head Start agency or contracted private provider you're looking to work with to serve children, how many children, and in this case, you're going to indicate both general education and any preschoolers with disabilities who are going to be included. Important to remember, Head Start agencies actually have a requirement to serve children with disabilities. So, so think of them as a good option for where preschoolers with disabilities can also be served. And then in this column, you'll be entering the per child rate that you'd be providing to each of these providers. And you'll notice that these per child amounts are different from each other across these 3 different private providers. And they're also different from what this district would be receiving from the Department of Education. So if I pull up quickly, not that, this. So in this particular case, I modeled out a district in Bergen County. And so for any who aren't familiar, your funding will be based on 3 different base per child rates. One based on children who are served in school district settings, one based on children who are served in private provider settings, and one based on children who are served in Head Start settings. And they're unique to each county. So you can see here about $8,300 is what the department would be sending to you for children in a Head Start setting, and $15,000 is what they'd be sending to you, if you were in Bergen County, that is, for any children in a private childcare center that you'd be contracting with. And you'll notice that I did not budget those full amounts for any of these providers. And the reason for that is because each of these base amounts in every county includes sort of baked in it, not just the cost of serving children in their classrooms, but also your district-wide costs for operating the program. So in addition to those classroom costs, the teacher, the teacher assistant, the materials and supplies, field trips, et cetera, you also have your district-wide costs, your master teacher, your nurse, your early childhood supervisor, a portion of your VA's time, maybe some space costs, any number of different things. So what's baked into all 3 of these per child rates is funding for those district-wide costs, funding for district-wide costs that really benefit every child, no matter what type of setting he or she is being served in. So what you want to do is go into this thinking about funding, a certain amount of funding that you're kind of taking off the top here to make sure that you can cover those district-wide costs. So that's one reason why you see these per child amounts somewhat lower, in some cases significantly lower than what the Department of Education is providing. The other reason that they're different is because each of these contracted providers has a 1 year, and ideally they have a long-term relationship with you, but their contract with you happens on a 1 year basis. So your funding for them is intended to cover their actual costs for that one school year. And they, unlike you, don't have the opportunity to carry funding over from year to year. So what you want to be doing is providing them with an amount of money that's going to allow them to meet all of the requirements of the program, but not go way over that amount. And the department will actually be asking you to go in and level set with the provider over the course of the school year. So if, for example, this provider who I'm projecting will need $12,500 per child to operate the program, meeting all of these DOE standards. If at the end of the year, what they really needed was $12,200 and they have some money left over, you'll be asked to recover those funds from that private provider. And those will then sort of be in your carryover that you would be able to bring over to the next year and then reallocate back out into your program, the private provider program, et cetera. So you want to try to get the best estimate that you can of what private providers really need to operate the program. Another point to keep in mind is that you can see that even within the same type of private provider, you may have two different per child rates that they need. And the per child rate from private provider can vary for any number of different reasons, including some private providers whose space is provided to them in kind. So a significant portion of what we might expect their expenditures to be could be zero, whereas another private provider might have a mortgage for which they would need a portion of funding to cover. Another thing that we see a lot is private providers who have teachers who've been with them for 30 years, who are making significantly more than another provider who might be opening a new classroom and hiring a teacher at the first step of the salary scale. So any number of these reasons are why you would see varying amounts among the per pupil amounts for contracted private providers. And in fact, the department, it would be a red flag for the department if they opened up this worksheet and saw the exact same amount listed across several different contracted private providers. They want to make sure that that these dollar amounts are being customized to the needs of each particular private provider. What you have the option to do but are not required to do, and this can be a little bit confusing because I know I just talked about taking money off the top of the base per child rate in order to figure out what private providers need and to make sure you're covering your district-wide costs. There's also this column here that talks about district withheld funds. And this is something that's different from what I was talking about earlier. This is something that you have the option to do, but are not required to do. In some cases, districts offer to private providers to take a small amount of money out of their per child amount to help them get some better buying power, for example, for materials and supplies. So you as a district are likely to get a much better rate when you're buying a whole bunch of materials and supplies together, as opposed to a private provider who just has a couple of classrooms. So sometimes districts and providers enter into that kind of relationship with each other, say, yes, take a little bit of my materials and supplies funding, buy those materials for me, and then supply them with me on the back end. So if you choose to do that, you would enter a negative dollar amount in this column, which would come off of the top of what actually would go into the private provider budget. What you have to remember, though, if you do this, is that this $22,500 number, or whatever it winds up being for you, needs to be added as a positive number in your district budget statement. So there's some steps to remember if this is something that you choose to do, but again, not something that you are required to do. One more point that I want to make, and this is something that hasn't come up yet, is the distinction on this worksheet between contracted enhanced Head Start sites and contracted expanded Head Start sites. For the most part, if you're working with a Head Start agency, they're going to fall into this category up here, this contracted enhanced Head Start sites. What this means is you have a Head Start agency that's serving a number of children. And within that number of children, they are going to be using some of their federal funding and some of the state funding to improve the programs and services that are being provided to those children. So really they're combining two different funding streams to improve the services that are provided for children. In this case, a contracted expanded Head Start site. This would be if you are in a conversation with a Head Start provider who happens to have empty classroom space in which they are not currently serving any children and are not funded by the federal government to serve any children. So they have open space that they're willing to dedicate towards serving more children. In this case, they would need we'd need to take into account the fact that they don't have federal funding already being used to serve these children. They would need a higher per child rate akin to what you would be providing to your regular contracted private providers. I have to say this is extremely rare. It really just doesn't happen all that often. It's an important distinction to know just in case you come across it. But I would say 99 times out of 100, you're going to be talking with a Head Start agency that wants to combine with you to better serve children they're already serving. In which case you're just using this set of rows here up at the top. So these numbers here on this worksheet, particularly the ones divided out here, the 112,500 that I've projected for this Head Start site, and then this total $525,000 for the two different private providers here. These numbers both need to get transferred onto your district budget statement, and I'll show you where as I pop over to that statement here. Try to make this one a little bit bigger too. So finally, we make it after an hour of all the other worksheets. We finally make it to the budget statement. At the top, ignore these numbers in red for a moment. I just put those in myself first to illustrate something in a moment. But the first thing you want to look at is this section up here. And if these projected enrollment numbers don't match what you were thinking you were doing for your program, then there's something wrong on table 1. These numbers pull in directly from table 1. So if you look at this and say, wait, 99 gen ed expansion, that's not what I thought. I thought I was doing 120. Then there's something on table 1 in this projected enrollment section that's not quite right. So these numbers pull directly from there. So you want to make sure that you're not surprised by what this is representing. If you are an Ekba or an LE district, your funding that you've already been approved for in the 21-22 school year should automatically appear in this cell right here. And that is, well, I'm going to put a pin in that for a second. I'm going to come back to that dollar amount. For both LE Ekba districts and every other district, your expanded number, the number of children you're looking to expand by, should appear in this cell, and then an associated dollar amount will appear in this cell, cell D14. For districts that don't currently get any funding from the DOE to serve children, this amount is going to be representative of those 3 base per child amounts that we were looking at before, multiplied by the number of children you have projected in each one of those settings. If you are an Ekba or an LE district, it's a little bit different. So essentially what the department is going to do, what this dollar amount is going to do, is take, let's see the clearest way that I can explain it. It's going to take new children who you're projecting to serve and multiply them by those higher per child rates. It's also then going to take the difference between what you're getting right now for these children and calculate the difference between that per child rate and what you should be getting for those children. And it's going to add that differential into this dollar amount here. So your per pupil amount, when you add this cell together with this cell, will represent those 3 base amounts times children based on where they're being served. I apologize. I know that's a little bit confusing, but the bottom line is that it's good news. The good news is that the department is trying to make you whole in terms of your current children. It's trying to move you up to these base per child amounts that they're funding other children based on. What I did here was just a quick calculation per child, what the average is. So in this district, that's projected to get 1.3 million. They're projecting to serve 99 gen ed kids. That comes out to roughly $13,560 per child. The reason I calculated this number is because of this row here. And it's because, again, your preschool education aid is intended only for your general education students. So for your preschoolers with disabilities who are being included in general education classrooms, the department is going to be looking for you to indicate what level of funding is going to be used to support those children. So their space, if you will, in each classroom isn't being covered by PEA. So the department's looking to see what money you are putting forward to cover the cost of them sitting in the classroom. And they'll look for the amount here to represent a per child rate that is comparable to this general education rate. So this isn't going to be inclusive of any additional services that these children need, just what it's going to cost for them to be in the inclusive setting. If you're an Ekba or an LA district and you happen to have carryover that you want to use towards your program in the 21-22 school year, you'll add that in this row here. And if you happen to be a district that wants to that is serving children on a tuition funded basis, again, that's going to be very rare. You would put that in here. And if you're looking to use any Title I or general funds or anything else to support the cost of the program, you would add that here. Not a requirement, just an option for you. And then the department provides a total here to look at what the total funding going towards serving preschoolers would be. These numbers then that are represented up here need to be, these dollar amounts need to be allocated in the columns in the middle of this worksheet. And the department's going to look to make sure that they're allocated accurately. So this 1.342581, they're going to look down here to make sure that they see 1.342581. And if you are off by even $1, you will get an error message. Can't stress enough, do not submit your application with one of these error messages showing. It will be a huge red flag to the reviewers, and it's just something you want to avoid at all costs. The most common reason for, so if you're looking at this number and you say, I swear I'm looking at it, this number matches this number, and you still get that error message, I guarantee you have a decimal problem. This formula does not like decimal points. So if you have a decimal point anywhere in numbers that are filled in up here, or in any of the allocations that you've made in any of these cells, it is going to give you an error message down here. So I'll just give you an example over here. So the dollar amount in here, 67,270. If I change it to 67,269.50, the number here still looks like 67,270, but it's reading it as 67,269.50, and the error message is going to pop up. So you just want to make sure that you go through, and the easiest thing is to just make sure you have round numbers that are going in there, and then you don't have to worry about it. In the district budget guidance, there is specific information about each of these lines and what positions should be allocated in each of those lines. So it tells you where to put your teachers, where to put your teacher assistants, where to put your early childhood supervisor, where to put the coaches, etc. So you want to make sure you follow those guidelines. That said, this obviously for any of the BAs on the line, looking at this, obviously this is not representative of the full chart of accounts that you have available to you on a normal basis. And the department's aware of that. However, these are the lines that you have. So you may run into a situation where you have something that you know is an allowable expense for the program, but there's no obvious line to put it in, or not the line that you would put it in if you had access to all the line, all the accounts that you normally have access to. What I would recommend is first double check the budget guidance and make sure that they don't specifically tell you where they want you to budget for it. If it's not noted anywhere there, the second thing I would do is to look at the lines you have available to you, choose the one that makes the most sense, and then be absolutely sure that you talk about it in your budget narrative. That's your best line of defense, is to just explain it there. So for example, this materials and supplies number here, I would explain this in my budget narrative, only because they don't necessarily know what I'm doing with this $50,000 here. So I would go ahead and just explain that, make sure I take out any question about what it might be for. We talked a little bit about split funding positions. You could, if you wanted to, with your special education funding, you could choose to split fund every position going down the budget, but you don't have to do that. You can split fund one, you can split fund none. However it is that you want to lay out your budget is fine. They're really going to be looking at your budget more holistically to make sure that you have funding where it makes sense for you to have funding, that you have funding in the teacher line, in the teacher assistant line. If in your program plan, you talk a lot about professional development, you want to make sure that you have money in the professional development line. So they'll look for things like that. We talked a little bit before about the private providers. So this purchased educational services contracted pre-K is where the $525,000 number that we looked at right here on the provider per pupil amounts workbook, that's where that would go. This 112,500 number for Head Start contracted programs would go in this row here for the purchased educational services Head Start. And then remember, I talked about if you choose to withhold funding for materials and supplies for your private providers, this is the line that funding would go into. So what I modeled out here is funding withheld for private providers, but also additional funding for the district classrooms in there. So I know, even though it took over an hour to get through it, I know I sped through some of those things. So I will take a breath here, and Beth, please jump in with anything that you think I forgot. But also folks on the line, please keep the questions coming in. We're happy to answer any and all that we can.
We do have a few questions in the chat, and then we can open it up with anybody. One question, two of them are related to the provider tab. So is the provider workbook due at the same time? And
no.
What if we have to supply the teacher?
No, the provider workbook is not required for you to submit with your application. I believe the department is looking for a letter from any provider you're looking to work with, just indicating that yes, we've had a conversation and we'd like to enter into this relationship with you. But no, you do not need to have your provider budget filled out yet. I don't think the department has supplied that to you yet, or at least not to my knowledge.
They would more likely, they would be, you would have a provider. I'm also not sure what DOE is collecting these days. They've alternately, at some points in recent years, they've collected provider budget workbooks, but they have not been recently. They do typically collect copies of provider contracts. So there will be contracts and provider workbooks that may or may not be collected that can be done at a later date.
Right.
What if we have to supply the teachers? I assume this question is about
salary level.
Salary. If the district is hiring on behalf of the provider, which is not typical. Typically, the provider does the hiring for.
Yes.
The provider does the hiring, sometimes in collaboration with the district, in consultation with them. Yeah. But typically, the position will be funded at the provider level.
That's absolutely right. So the provider will maintain sort of authority over its own employees, including the teachers, unless you negotiate something different with them. And you are responsible in the application. It indicates that teachers in private provider and Head Start settings need to be paid comparably to teachers in district settings based on their experience and their credentials. So wherever they would land, if they were to walk into your district, wherever they would land on your salary guide is how they should be paid at the private provider setting.
And then there's a question when estimating what gets paid to private provider, are we turning over the full projected amount to them? We're paying them on an invoice basis. You did talk about estimating care, but we didn't talk about how we're billing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a a lot of information about this in the contract that you'd sign with your private provider. And the expectation is that you would actually equate fairly similar to how you receive state aid. You would be providing them with a monthly payment that would get prorated based on their enrollment. So if they dip down below a certain level, you might have to withhold some of their funding on a monthly basis, but they get funded monthly by you. You may need to make adjustments to their payments based on enrollment and their actual spending, so that at the end of the year, they don't have, a huge chunk of money that's due back to you. But the contract does lay out the schedule of payments and the expectations that the providers need to follow in terms of their expenditures.
Do districts typically collect a monthly expenditure report from the provider in order to make
Yes.
payment?
They do, not necessarily monthly. I believe it's required to collect a quarterly expenditure report. Some districts choose to do it monthly. So it's really up to you. It could be helpful first time through. Actually, I could make an argument either way. First year relationship with a private provider, I could make an argument for doing it monthly, just so you are all continually checking to make sure you're on the same page. I could also see an argument for doing it quarterly, just to let them kind of get their feet wet and kind of see how things are going. But it would be up to you. It needs to be done at least quarterly, though.
Here's a question that is related again to the top of the budget statement, I'd think.
Sure.
If you're an Ekba district, can you combine the budget for 21-22, since that basically turns into PEA? So can you talk again about sort of how the front page will populate this and the money will get automatically sort of rolled out across those two funding streams?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the expectation is that you're going to be using these dollar amounts together to run the program. Unfortunately, though, what you're being asked to do down here is to allocate the funding separately, which I can appreciate might be a little bit annoying. So for example, for you all, you might have and again, you could do this in a number of different ways. You could say, I'm using my old money and my new money to fund my teachers. I'm using my old money and my new money to fund my teacher assistants. You could also just fund, you could do it in chunks if you wanted to. You could do all of the teacher salaries out of your old Ekba LE funding. You could do all of your TAs out of your expansion PEA funding. Honestly, as long as your dollar amounts here don't have the check total message, you'll be in good shape. And they will be looking, they will be looking holistically at your budget to make sure that all of your costs are met. Something I didn't mention and should have, and this is really important, is that your reviewers are going to be going back and forth between Schedule A and the district budget statement to make sure that everyone you said you were going to fund through PEA, that these amounts really have been transferred accurately onto the district budget statement. So something to keep in mind as you're filling out Schedule A, those numbers need to get transferred accurately onto the district budget statement, and they will check back and forth to make sure that no one was forgotten or on one sheet or the other. But just to reiterate the original question, you do need to separate out your two pots of funding, but how you allocate it is really up to you. It really is just a holistic approach that the reviewers will take.
And I just want to reiterate what Karen is saying, which is that the salaries on Schedule A should total the salaries. Teacher salaries on Schedule A should total exactly the salaries on the budget statement. You don't be like padding it out or whatever. You're going to be sure that they match.
Right. So in this case, the total is $235,660 for teachers, and hopefully I did that. Yes. You'll notice here, for anyone who likes to use Excel, you can put in a formula here to pull from Schedule A. So that can be a helpful way to do it. That way, if you need to make any tweaks to Schedule A, it'll automatically carry over into the budget statement. Just one word of caution, oftentimes I notice that people tend to use decimal points on Schedule A. So just be careful again. If you do that, you may wind up with an error message here that doesn't understand your decimals.
The next question is about, it's going to look back to table 1. How do you report the number of students funded by Ekba on table 1? And then for the budget statement, are they related?
Yes. So for those districts that are Ekba districts, you are in the top portion for actual enrollment. You're going to show the children you served with Ekba and LE funding in these rows. The children you served in the 2021 school year, you'll show in these top rows where it says Ekba LE. For projected enrollment, you're going to do a combination of things. You're going to show some children in these Ekba LE rows, the children it can be a little bit complicated. I was going to say the children who you're currently projected to serve, but in many cases you might currently be serving children in a half-day program, and you don't want to show them in that half-day program anymore. You want to show them in a full-day program. So this doesn't necessarily need to match exactly what was approved by the department earlier this year. Instead, what I would represent here is the number of children who you are using Ekba LE, your current Ekba LE funding to support based on this new configuration that you're moving towards. So it could actually be fewer children. So say, for example, in April, the department approved you to serve, I don't know, 10 children, 10 3-year-olds and 8 4-year-olds in a full day program, but it wasn't meeting all of DOE standards, et cetera, et cetera. You could, in theory, submit to the department something that shows something like this. You show, in order to meet the standards, I'm going to use that funding to serve 5 children each, 3s and 4s in a higher quality program, and then additional children I'm going to show in this expansion PEA row. So you can make an argument there that I don't think any of our Ekba LE districts on this call are receiving a level of funding to provide the program meeting this new level of standards. So it would be perfectly acceptable to actually show a smaller number in these Ekba LE PEA rows than you were approved for originally this year, and then model out here that on top of those children who you're going to improve services for, you're also going to serve additional children.
And I will answer a question that Michael asked, which is, does Rutgers charge districts a fee for assisting them with completing the application? No, we are here at your service. We are funded generously through the Mar and Taub foundations. I will say that we are handling requests on a first come, first served basis. We will do our best to help all of you with any questions that you have. And some questions are going to come from this webinar. We understand you're going to have this particular instance in your district that maybe doesn't get addressed today here, and we're happy to respond to your questions. There is a question of some of our students paid tuition and the district had to add money to support the program. So there's not exactly a question here, but if anybody wants to, at this point, if you'd like to unmute your mic, Edith, would you like to ask the question that you're wondering about with the tuition students?
And while you're unmuting yourself, I might be able to anticipate what the question is around that. The goal here would be for you to not have to do either of those things anymore, not have to charge parents tuition and not have to add any general funds to serve children, but instead you'd be receiving preschool education aid from the department at such a level that you could support the full cost of the program with that funding.
Okay, this is Edith. Thank you very much for answering that question.
Sure.
And that was my issue. I guess my question was that we were awarded approximately like $36,000, which obviously does not cover the
Doesn't get you very far, yeah,
or anything of that nature. And that's what has been happening the last several years.
Sure.
So that's just why I wanted to make sure, where do I put that notification in there?
Notification
or just that information that, I guess like in table 1 from last year, we,
You'd be indicating however many children you served last year.
whether they paid tuition or not?
So you could put them in this tuition line as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So you could put children in a combination of the Ekba LE line and the tuition line. I would say so you probably, did you have some children who came in for free and then some children who paid tuition?
Yes, apparently that's how, over the past couple of years, that's how our Ekba LE funding was based on the number of free and reduced students, preschool students that we had in the ASSA for the next year. So I didn't know if that was what you wanted me to report.
Right. So what you'd be reporting is that the children who you served for free, you would put them in this Ekba LE line, and then the children who came in on a tuition basis, regardless of whether you had to top that off with another funding stream, you would put them in this tuition line.
Okay.
Yep.
And I would say the first question of the application gives you an opportunity to give an overview of your current program. Without going into a lot of detail, you could put that into your first overview. This is how we've been, running our program in recent years. And it could, because really what you want to do is in your narrative application is paint a picture of what wonderful things this new funding would do for your district. And so part of it is that you're going to be able to serve families without charging tuition and without drawing from the district coffers.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful.
There is a question about, we plan to serve the whole universe. We will use private providers and also look into a rental facility. Can we list as a to be determined facility? Also with private providers, can we add or delete providers along the way?
Okay, so I think that's sort of a two-part question. So in terms of a to be determined facility, I don't think that would fly well in the application. They're looking to see space that's been identified. What you could do is say that you're exploring a new facility for future years, but in order to get your application approved for the 21-22 school year, you need to have the spaces identified.
Because you'd really need all associated costs. So you would have to know what your costs for leasing the facility are or all of that to be able to do your budget. Sorry.
Right. No, not at all. And then the other question in terms of private providers. So the answer is yes, but. So I think that if you talk to any Abbott district that contracts, I think they would tell you that they have providers who they have contracted with since day one, and they've had a great relationship. They've had providers come and go also over time. So the expectation of the department is that once you enter into a relationship with private providers, that you would continue that relationship. The idea is definitely not to build buildings that would then supplant private provider classrooms. So we know children are being served in these classrooms already. What we'd really like to do is have these classrooms folded into the state-funded preschool program and increase their quality. So while there is an expectation that once you start contracting with private providers, you do everything that you can to maintain that relationship over time, that's not to say that you have to be stuck in a bad relationship with a private provider. So sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes providers decide that meeting all the state standards is more than they bargained for. Sometimes their quality isn't up to par and it's not getting up to par over the course of time. So you do have the ability to end relationships with private providers when it's warranted. But the department is going to, look to try to help you maintain those relationships to the greatest extent possible, but certainly not in a situation where children aren't being served well or are being harmed. But really, they're looking for a partnership between school districts and community providers.
Thank you, Karen. There's a question here for me. Does our application have to be 100% complete in order to be reviewed by your staff? I suggested a deadline of this Friday, the 30th, for review. That gives our reviewers the full week to read all of your applications. We are happy to have a phone conversation with you. You are happy to send us a draft in whatever form it is by Friday. If you hold it till early next week, we just can't be sure. I mean, we'll keep working with you as much as we can up until the deadline, but we want to be able to review applications. I'm working on reviewing applications with 2 consultants, Pam Berlante, who's here today. Thank you, Pam, for responding to one of our questions, and Amanda Colon, who you met through the DOE Technical Assistance Mandatory Meeting. The later the application comes in, the more likely it is that we may not have time to fully review it, get it back to you so that you can make changes. So I'd say get us what you can by Friday of this week. And certainly if you want to give it to us in chunks, you can, but we'll have to just see how things go and whether we get, backed up. Like I said, we'll get as much woman power on it as we can to help you through the last efforts. It's preferable for us to see your narrative application at the same time we're looking at your budget workbook, because we like to take those 2 things in tandem. If you want to send us one or the other first and then follow within the next day or so with the other one, that would be okay too, but get requests in as soon as you can. And I'll try to be sure everybody gets assigned out to someone who can help. Certainly budget, any questions that come up, if you have specific questions or you just need to get one of us on the phone, in the next few days, you can reach out to me and I'll see what we can do to answer specific questions you have about how things go on your budget.
So I know that we just hit 4:30, and I'm more than happy to stick around and keep answering questions, but just for anyone who has to pop off and didn't hear this in the beginning, we are recording this session, so we'll make sure that it's available to you if there are any parts that you want to listen to over again. And as Beth was just saying, we're not going away. We're here to answer your questions. Even if you're stuck on one thing and you have one question and you just need some help or advice, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're very committed to expanding preschool in the state of New Jersey. We want you guys to all be successful and have great programs. So please use us. But again, we'll stick around and keep answering questions for anyone who has them. I shouldn't speak on behalf of Beth and Kate, but I can stick around.
I'm happy to stick around. No, I'm available to stick around, and I will, as Karen mentioned, the budget workbook tips I'll send out likely at this point tomorrow morning, so I can be sure I get it out to everybody that needs it, and we'll send the link to this recording for anyone else in your district that might benefit from viewing it in the next few days.
So folks, feel free to stick other questions in the chat, or you're also welcome to just unmute yourself and ask questions. We're pretty informal.
And otherwise, I would say thank you for coming. If you have to pop off, I hope this has been helpful. My email address is in the chat a couple of different ways. You've also heard from me by email, so feel free to reach out at any time.
And Beth, I can put my email address in the chat as well, or you're welcome if you haven't already. Okay.
And good luck.
Yeah.
Started to type Karen Gardner.
Are you putting it in, Beth?
I got it.
You got it.
Let's see, but no.
People hung in there for a Monday afternoon. That's good on you all.
And I'll send, for people who were not registered for today's meeting, I will send the budget workbook tips out to all eligible district superintendents and BAs.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Mary Ann, for coming. Pre-K Our Way was in the house today. Does anyone have any questions?
No, it looks like a couple people sent direct messages to me.
Okay.
And I don't know that they're still on the call. So unfortunately, I'm I'm hoping maybe they also sent them to you. Looks like, yep, it looks like they sent them. I think we answered all of those questions. I'm so busy looking at the forms, I never looked at the chat. So
It's okay, yeah. You weren't supposed to, you were busy.